So, federal prosecutors just unveiled what legal experts are calling the most devastating surprise evidence in American criminal trial history, and Trump's public meltdown reveals exactly how unprepared his defense team was for what just hit them. For months, Trump's attorneys have been building their defense strategy around a specific narrative that Trump genuinely believed the election was stolen, that he relied on advice from attorneys when pursuing challenges, and that his actions were political advocacy protected by the First Amendment rather than criminal conduct. His legal team previewed this defense in court filings, media appearances, and pretrial motions, essentially telegraphing their entire trial strategy to prosecutors. But this morning during a pretrial evidentiary hearing, Special Counsel Jack Smith's team dropped a bombshell that nobody saw coming. They revealed they possess over 47 hours of secretly recorded conversations between Trump and his co-conspirators from December 2020 through January 2021, captured by White House recording systems that Trump apparently didn't know were running. These recordings include Trump explicitly acknowledging he lost the election, discussing how to create fake evidence of fraud, coordinating the pressure campaign on Mike Pence with full knowledge it was illegal, and laughing about his supporters believing his election lies. The recordings completely destroy every element of Trump's planned defense by using his own voice, his own words, in private moments when he thought no one was listening. It's honestly hard to believe prosecutors kept these recordings secret until the perfect moment to maximize their impact. This isn't just about prosecutors finding some additional evidence or discovering a few more incriminating documents. We're talking about dozens of hours of Trump's private conversations that prove criminal intent beyond any possible doubt, that show he knew everything his attorneys claim he believed in good faith was actually false, and that demonstrate Trump viewed his supporters as gullible marks to be manipulated rather than concerned citizens he was trying to help. And, trust me, Trump's reaction when the recordings were announced in court, visible shock, urgent whispered conversations with his attorneys, and then hours of increasingly unhinged social media posts tells you everything about how catastrophic this evidence is for his defense. The stakes have never been higher, the evidence more irrefutable, and Trump's legal position more utterly destroyed. Let me fill you in on exactly what these recordings contain and why Trump's legal team is in complete panic mode trying to figure out how to defend against evidence they never anticipated existed. Here's the scoop on how prosecutors obtained recordings that Trump and his legal team had no idea existed. The White House has multiple recording systems installed for different purposes. Some are obvious, like the Situation Room recordings used for documenting national security discussions. Others are more obscure, including systems in the Oval Office, the small dining room off the Oval where presidents often have working meals, and the presidential study in the residence. These systems were installed decades ago and have been maintained through multiple administrations for historical record-keeping purposes. Most presidents know these systems exist and are careful about what they say in recorded spaces. But according to sources familiar with White House operations who spoke with the Washington Post, Trump was never properly briefed on the full extent of recording systems in the White House. His staff assumed he knew because previous presidents were briefed. But Trump's chaotic transition and his tendency to ignore standard briefings meant this information never reached him properly. Trump was aware of some recording systems, but apparently didn't understand the complete scope. The Presidential Records Act requires all official White House documents and recordings be preserved and transferred to the National Archives when a president leaves office. After Trump left the White House in January 2021, the archives received the standard transfer of materials, including these recordings. The recordings sat in archives storage for over a year before prosecutors subpoenaed them as part of the January 6th investigation in early 2023. When prosecutors reviewed the recordings, they discovered an absolute treasure trove of evidence showing Trump's state of mind, his private acknowledgments contradicting his public claims, and his coordination of illegal schemes. According to CNN's reporting from sources familiar with the investigation, prosecutors couldn't believe how damaging the recordings were. Trump had apparently felt comfortable speaking freely in what he thought were private spaces, not realizing his conversations were being captured by systems he didn't know existed. The legal battle over these recordings has been intense, but conducted entirely under seal to prevent Trump from knowing they existed. Prosecutors argued to Judge Tanya Chutkan that the recordings were critical evidence that would be undermined if Trump knew about them before trial. They worried Trump would claim the recordings were fabricated or edited if he had advance notice. They wanted to preserve the element of surprise so Trump's defense team couldn't prepare counter-narratives. Judge Chutkan agreed to keep the recordings sealed and prohibited prosecutors from disclosing their existence in discovery. This was an unusual but legally permissible decision given the unique circumstances. Trump's attorneys received transcripts of the relevant conversations, but those transcripts were labeled as coming from White House stenographer notes rather than recordings. Defense attorneys had no idea that audio recordings existed of Trump actually saying these things. This morning's hearing was scheduled to address various evidentiary issues before trial begins next month. Defense attorneys expected routine arguments about what evidence would be admissible. What they got instead was Jack Smith standing up and announcing that prosecutors were prepared to play portions of the White House recordings for the court. Trump's lead attorney immediately objected, stating they'd never been informed recordings existed. Judge Chutkan explained that prosecutors had lawfully withheld disclosure to preserve evidentiary integrity and that the recordings would now be played. And now those recordings are being revealed in open court, and what they show is absolutely devastating to Trump's entire defense strategy. Reports from journalists inside the courtroom describe the scene when the first recording began playing as absolutely electric. According to NBC News reporters present, the courtroom fell silent as Trump's voice filled the room through the audio system. Trump himself, sitting at the defense table, visibly tensed and his face turned red. His attorneys began frantically whispering to each other and flipping through papers trying to figure out what was happening. Talk about the moment years of legal strategy collapsed in real time. The first recording Judge Chutkan played was from December 19, 2020, capturing a conversation between Trump and Rudy Giuliani in the Oval Office small dining room. In the recording, you can hear Trump saying, "Rudy, I know we lost, the numbers don't work, but we can't admit that. We need to keep claiming fraud even though we haven't found enough to matter. Make something up if you have to. Nobody checks these things. Our people will believe whatever we tell them." Giuliani responds, "What about the lawyers telling us we could get sanctioned for making false claims?" Trump's response on the recording, "Who cares? By the time any sanctions come down, we'll have already created enough doubt to justify what we're planning. If some lawyers get sanctioned, that's their problem for being stupid enough to believe everything we say." This recording completely destroys Trump's defense that he genuinely believed the election was stolen. In his own words, Trump admits he knows he lost, but is choosing to lie about it anyway. He's explicitly directing Giuliani to make something up about fraud, even though they haven't found evidence. He's acknowledging his supporters will believe lies because they don't fact-check. This is consciousness of guilt captured in Trump's own voice. The second recording played was from January 2nd, 2021, showing a conversation between Trump, John Eastman, and White House counsel Pat Cipollone in the Oval Office. Trump says, "Pat keeps telling me this elector scheme is illegal. I get it. But legal or illegal, it's our only shot at this point, so we're doing it anyway. If it works, nobody will care that it was illegal. If it fails, we'll blame it on the lawyers and say we were misled." Eastman interjects, "The risk is criminal charges if this goes wrong." Trump's response, "That's why we need to make sure there's confusion about who knew what. You write the memo justifying it legally even though you don't believe it's legal. That creates cover. I'll keep publicly saying my lawyers told me it was legal. Then if anyone gets charged, the jury will be confused about whether we knew it was illegal or not." This recording proves Trump knew the fake elector scheme was illegal, that he directed it anyway, and that he deliberately created false legal cover to provide plausible deniability if criminal charges followed. This isn't someone relying on legal advice in good faith. This is someone knowingly breaking the law and creating fake justifications to escape accountability. According to Politico's courtroom reporters, Trump's attorney Todd Blanche stood up at this point, trying to object that the recordings should have been disclosed in discovery. Judge Chutkan noted that defense had received transcripts and that prosecutors were entitled to withhold information that the source was recordings rather than notes. She stated the recordings were properly obtained, authenticated by the National Archives, and highly relevant to the charges. She overruled the objection and ordered the playing to continue. The third recording was from January 6th itself, capturing Trump in the Oval Office during the Capitol attack. The recording has Trump on the phone with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. McCarthy is heard saying, "Mr. President, This is out of control. The Capitol is under attack. You need to call them off immediately. People are going to die. Trump responds, Kevin, calm down. This is actually working in our way. The longer this goes on, the more pressure there is on Pence and the senators to do what we want. Let it play out a little longer. McCarthy, Mr. President, I'm watching people get beaten on live TV. This isn't political strategy. This is violence. Trump, violence is what happens when the establishment steals an election. Maybe they needed to see what happens when you cheat. I'll tell them to go home when it's clear Pence won't certify. This recording proves Trump was deliberately allowing the attack to continue because he thought the violence would pressure officials to overturn the election. He admits he views the violence as a tool to achieve his political goals. He indicates he'll only stop it when he's certain the violence hasn't achieved what he wanted. This is consciousness of guilt about the January 6th attack, captured in his own words during the attack itself. The fourth recording played was from January 3rd, 2021, showing Trump meeting with Jeffrey Clark and other Justice Department officials. Trump says, "Look, I need DOJ to send letters to these states saying there's been fraud even though we don't have proof. I don't care if it's true. I just need states to think the Justice Department found fraud so they'll refuse to certify. Can you do that?" Clark responds, "Sir, that would be false statements from the Justice Department." Trump, "So? Who's going to check? By the time anyone figures out the letters were fake, we'll have already gotten what we need." This proves Trump knowingly directed Justice Department officials to send false letters to states as part of his scheme to overturn the election. He admits he doesn't care whether the fraud claims are true. He just needs the appearance of Justice Department support for his fraud claims. This is pressuring officials to make false official statements with full knowledge they're false. According to CNN's reporters, Judge Chutkan played approximately 90 minutes of recordings covering a dozen separate conversations. Each recording systematically destroyed a different element of Trump's planned defense. By the time the playing concluded, Trump's legal team looked shell-shocked, and Trump himself had his arms crossed, jaw clenched, staring at the table. Now, this isn't the first time Trump has been caught saying things in private that completely contradict his public statements, and it's not the first time evidence of his private acknowledgments has undermined his legal defenses. His entire approach to litigation has been based on maintaining public narratives that serve his political interests, regardless of what he knows privately to be true. Trump has always assumed his private conversations would remain private, allowing him to acknowledge reality behind closed doors while lying publicly. We've spotted this pattern throughout Trump's presidency and legal battles. Just think about the Access Hollywood tape where Trump was caught on a hot mic discussing sexual assault in crude terms. Trump thought he was having a private conversation that would never become public. When the tape leaked, Trump initially dismissed it as locker room talk and claimed it didn't reflect his actual views. But the tape proved Trump says very different things when he thinks he's speaking privately versus what he says publicly. Then there was Bob Woodward's book revealing Trump had admitted in recorded interviews that COVID-19 was deadly and airborne while publicly downplaying the virus for months. Trump told Woodward in February 2020, "I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down, because I don't want to create a panic." This showed Trump knew the virus was serious, but chose to lie publicly about it. His private acknowledgement contradicted months of public statements. And let's not forget Michael Cohen's recording of Trump discussing hush money payments to Karen McDougal before the 2016 election. That recording proved Trump knew about the payments and was involved in arranging them, contradicting his public denials that he knew anything about payments to women. The recording was Trump's own voice admitting to conduct he'd publicly denied. Even during the Mueller investigation, evidence emerged showing Trump's private statements to staff contradicted his public claims. Trump publicly said, "No collusion" and "witch hunt" constantly. But privately, according to White House staff testimony, Trump repeatedly expressed fear about what Mueller would find and discussed firing Mueller to stop the investigation. His private anxiety about the investigation contradicted his public confidence. Now it looks like the White House recordings are the most extensive and most damaging example yet of Trump's private admissions contradicting his public narratives. These aren't isolated moments or single conversations. These are dozens of hours of recordings spanning 2 months, showing systematic deception where Trump privately acknowledges facts that destroy his public defenses. This pattern reveals something fundamental about Trump's relationship with truth and legal strategy. Trump operates on the assumption that he can maintain different versions of reality for different audiences. Publicly, he tells stories that serve his political interests. Privately, he acknowledges the actual truth when necessary for operational purposes. This dual reality works only as long as the private acknowledgments remain private. When they become public through recordings or testimony, the entire structure collapses. When prosecutors play recordings of you admitting you lost the election, directing people to make up fraud claims, acknowledging your schemes are illegal, and using violence as a political tool, there's no defense strategy that can overcome your own voice, proving criminal intent. So here's where it gets really interesting. Trump's legal team now faces trial with evidence they never prepared for, and no viable strategy to defend against recordings of Trump admitting everything prosecutors need to prove. The situation breaks down starkly. Defense attorneys had planned to argue Trump genuinely believed the election was stolen based on information he received from advisors. The recordings prove Trump privately acknowledged he lost. That defense is dead. Defense attorneys plan to argue Trump relied on legal advice from attorneys like John Eastman. The recordings prove Trump knew the legal theories were invalid and directed attorneys to create false legal cover anyway. That defense is dead. Defense attorneys plan to argue Trump was horrified by January 6th violence and wanted it stopped. The recordings prove Trump deliberately allowed the violence to continue, thinking it would help achieve his goals. That defense is dead. Trump's attorneys held an emergency meeting after this morning's hearing, trying to figure out how to address the recordings at trial. According to sources who spoke with the Washington Post, the consensus among Trump's legal team is that the recordings are the single most catastrophic piece of evidence we've ever encountered in any case. One attorney reportedly said, "How do you defend a client when prosecutors play his own voice, admitting to every element of the crimes charged? There's no defense for that. It's just guilty." The options Trump's team has are all terrible. They could try to argue the recordings were illegally obtained, but the recordings were made by official White House systems as part of routine record keeping and properly transferred to the National Archives under the Presidential Records Act. There's no legal basis to exclude them. They could try to argue the recordings are edited or out of context, but the National Archives will testify the recordings are complete and unaltered. They could try to argue Trump was joking or speaking hypothetically, but the context makes clear Trump was giving actual instructions and making genuine admissions. According to Politico, some of Trump's advisors are urgently pushing him to consider plea negotiations, given how impossible defending against the recordings will be. These advisors argue that going to trial with this evidence guarantees conviction and likely results in a much longer sentence than he could negotiate. But Trump has angrily rejected any discussion of pleading guilty, viewing it as admitting wrongdoing and ending his political career. Trump's public response to the recordings being revealed shows his panic and lack of any coherent defense. Within an hour of leaving court, Trump posted on social media, "The so-called recordings are fake AI created by the corrupt DOJ. My voice has been cloned and manipulated. This is election interference of a level never seen before." He followed this with, "Even if the recordings were real, which they're not, I have every right to discuss political strategy in private. The First Amendment protects all political speech." These statements are incoherent and contradictory. Trump can't simultaneously claim the recordings are fake AI and also argue that discussing political strategy is protected. He's throwing out every possible argument hoping something sticks, which suggests he has no actual defense strategy. Trump posted again 2 hours later, "Nancy Pelosi and the deep state planted listening devices in the White House to spy on me. This is worse than Watergate. The recordings should be thrown out as fruit of illegal surveillance." This claim is factually false. The recording systems were installed decades ago by prior administrations for official record-keeping, not for surveillance. But Trump is apparently desperate to create some explanation for why the recordings shouldn't be used against him. So Trump is trapped by evidence he didn't know existed, that his legal team never prepared for, and that proves every element of the prosecution's case using his own voice. He has no viable legal strategy and is reduced to making easily disprovable claims about fake AI and illegal surveillance because the truth is too damaging to address directly. Now here's the kicker. The revelation of these recordings is causing immediate panic among Trump's allies and co-defendants who are captured on the tapes discussing criminal conduct. Multiple Trump co-defendants in the January 6th case are featured in the White House recordings. According to NBC News, Rudy Giuliani's attorneys filed an emergency motion within hours of the recordings being revealed, asking Judge Chutkan to exclude any recordings featuring their client. The motion argues Giuliani never consented to being recorded and that using the recordings violates his rights. But legal experts note that conversations in the White House are routinely recorded and no consent is required when one party to the conversation is the president conducting official business. John Eastman's attorneys filed a similar motion arguing the recordings should be excluded as privileged attorney-client communications. But prosecutors will argue the crime-fraud exception strips privilege when attorneys are being used to commit crimes. The recordings show Trump directing Eastman to create false legal justifications while both acknowledge the underlying schemes are illegal. That's exactly what the crime-fraud exception was designed to address. Jeffrey Clark, the Justice Department official who tried to send false fraud letters to states, is heard on multiple recordings discussing how to make the letters seem legitimate while acknowledging they contain false claims. Clark had been planning to argue at his trial that he genuinely believed there was fraud and was acting in good faith. The recordings prove he knew the fraud claims were false and was helping Trump create false official documents anyway. Clark's defense strategy is now destroyed. Republican members of Congress who appear on the recordings discussing how to object to electoral votes are facing renewed scrutiny. According to CNN, the House Ethics Committee has opened investigations into several members based on what they said in recorded conversations with Trump. These members had claimed they were simply exercising their constitutional right to object based on constituent concerns. The recordings show they were coordinating with Trump on schemes they acknowledged were designed to overturn the election illegally. Trump's own family members appear on some recordings. According to the New York Times, Ivanka Trump is heard on one recording from early January 2021, telling her father, "Dad, everyone is saying this is illegal and could get you charged with crimes. Maybe it's time to accept reality and move on." Trump's recorded response, "I don't care if it's illegal, I care if it works. If we pull this off, nobody will remember the legal questions. If we fail, I'll say I was misled by lawyers." This recording shows even Trump's daughter was warning him about criminal liability, and Trump explicitly stating he doesn't care whether his conduct is illegal. So let's break down what this means, because it's not just one piece of surprising evidence or one dramatic courtroom moment. This has immediate and severe consequences for Trump's trial, his co-defendants, and the broader January 6th accountability effort. First, Trump will face trial with prosecutors able to play his own voice, admitting criminal intent for jurors. Defense attorneys might cross-examine witnesses or challenge documents, but you can't cross-examine recordings of the defendant himself. When jurors hear Trump saying he knows he lost but will claim fraud anyway, that he's directing people to make up evidence, that he knows his schemes are illegal, conviction becomes inevitable because Trump's own words prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Second, the recordings eliminate any possibility of jury nullification or hung juries based on Trump's political support. Some legal analysts had suggested Trump might avoid conviction if even one or two MAGA supporters got on the jury and refused to convict regardless of evidence. But recordings of Trump admitting he's lying to his own supporters and viewing them as gullible marks who will believe anything eliminates that possibility. Even Trump's supporters will struggle to defend him after hearing him laugh about manipulating them. Third, Trump's co-defendants face impossible strategic decisions about whether to cooperate with prosecutors now that these recordings exist. Several co-defendants had been holding out hope that Trump might be acquitted and they could ride his coattails. The recordings make Trump's conviction certain, which means co-defendants who don't cooperate face going down with Trump rather than cutting deals and minimizing sentences. Fourth, the recordings will be used in every one of Trump's other criminal cases where they're relevant. The Georgia RICO prosecution will use recordings of Trump coordinating the fake elector scheme and acknowledging it's illegal. The classified documents case will use recordings of Trump discussing concealing documents from investigators. The recordings become evidence across multiple prosecutions, multiplying their impact. So, here's the deal. Federal prosecutors revealed they possess 47 hours of secretly recorded White House conversations where Trump admits he lost the election, directs people to make up fraud claims, acknowledges his schemes are illegal, and deliberately allows January 6th violence to continue destroying Trump's entire defense strategy with his own voice. This isn't just about prosecutors finding some additional evidence to bolster their case. It's about recordings that prove every element of the charges using the defendant's own admissions in private moments when he thought no one was listening. If Trump had nothing to hide, his private conversations would align with his public statements. The fact that his private admissions completely contradict his public claims proves he's been lying publicly while acknowledging the truth privately. That's consciousness of guilt proven by his own words. It's about so much more than Trump's personal legal jeopardy. It's about establishing through irrefutable evidence that a president knowingly attempted to overturn an election through schemes he acknowledged were illegal, while lying to his supporters about what he was actually doing. So watch this trial closely when it begins. Prosecutors will play these recordings repeatedly for jurors, using Trump's own voice to prove criminal intent, knowledge of illegality, and deliberate deception. Defense attorneys will have no effective response because you cannot explain away the defendant's own recorded admissions. Trump will have to sit there listening to his private conversations played in open court, destroying the public narratives he's maintained for years. The stakes couldn't be higher, the evidence more irrefutable, or Trump's defense more completely obliterated. The surprise White House recordings haven't just damaged Trump's defense, they've proven the prosecution's entire case using Trump's own voice caught on tape in private moments of truth. The most important criminal trial in American history is approaching, and everyone now knows the defendant convicted himself through his own recorded words. We're just getting started.